A wealthy woman slammed her champagne glass onto the first-class tray table and pointed directly at the elderly black veteran sitting beside her. "I paid too much money to sit next to him," she snapped loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. Passengers turned immediately, flight attendants froze, and within seconds, the entire first-class section became painfully silent. But less than 20 minutes later, after one announcement from the cockpit, that same woman would realize the quiet old man she tried to remove from first class was someone the entire crew respected enough to stand for. Before we begin, comment your city and what time it is right now, because this story starts 30,000 feet above the ground with public humiliation in front of an entire airplane cabin. But what happens next leaves an entire flight speechless. It was supposed to be a smooth luxury flight from New York to Los Angeles. Wealthy passengers, expensive seats, champagne before takeoff. And when an elderly black veteran quietly boarded the aircraft carrying a worn military duffel bag in one hand, nobody imagined the entire plane would soon stop moving because of him. The airport buzzed with polished luxury and controlled chaos as passengers moved through the first-class boarding lane beneath bright terminal lights. Flight attendants welcomed travelers with professional smiles, while business executives rolled designer luggage toward the jet bridge. The first-class cabin itself looked pristine. Cream leather seats, warm overhead lighting, glasses already waiting beside folded napkins. The kind of environment designed to make wealthy people feel important before the plane even left the ground. Most passengers boarding first class carried themselves with practiced confidence. Expensive watches, loud phone calls, the quiet assumption that comfort belonged to them more than everyone else. Near the middle of the boarding line stood an elderly black man wearing a dark navy overcoat over a neatly pressed shirt and tie. In one hand, he carried an old military duffel bag faded with age and years of use. The bag looked worn compared to the polished designer luggage surrounding him, but the man himself stood with calm dignity. His movements were slow now, but disciplined, careful, intentional. He looked somewhere in his early 70s, silver-gray beard, deep lines around his eyes, the kind of face that carried history quietly without needing attention. His name was Colonel Isaiah Brooks, retired Marine veteran. But nobody in the terminal knew that yet. To most passengers, he simply looked like an older black man who somehow ended up inside an expensive cabin where people like him supposedly didn't belong. A younger flight attendant scanning boarding passes smiled warmly at him. "Welcome aboard, sir." Isaiah nodded politely. "Thank you." He moved slowly down the aisle until he reached seat 2A beside the window. He carefully placed the old duffel bag beneath the seat in front of him before lowering himself into the leather chair with visible stiffness in his back and shoulders. Nearby passengers barely acknowledged him. Some glanced briefly at the bag, others looked at his age. Others noticed his skin color before immediately looking away again. Across the aisle sat Vanessa Whitmore. Mid-50s, wealthy, perfect makeup, diamond bracelet shining beneath the cabin lights. The type of passenger who treated first class less like transportation and more like proof of status. The moment she saw Isaiah settling into the seat beside her, her expression changed immediately. Subtle at first, then sharper. She looked him up and down slowly. The old duffel bag, the worn shoes, the silver beard. Then she pressed the flight attendant call button before the cabin door had even closed. The soft chime of the call button sounded above Vanessa's seat, while nearby passengers continued settling into the cabin. A young flight attendant named Rachel approached with a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am?" Vanessa leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled while still making sure nearby passengers could hear. "I think there's been a mistake. Rachel blinked politely. "Excuse me?" Vanessa glanced openly toward Isaiah sitting quietly beside the window. "This man is in the wrong seat." Several nearby passengers immediately looked up after hearing the comment. Isaiah remained calm, staring quietly out the window like he had heard versions of this conversation before. Rachel checked the boarding tablet quickly. "No, ma'am," she replied carefully. "Seat 2A is assigned correctly." Vanessa's expression tightened immediately. "No," she said slowly. "I specifically booked this section because I wanted a comfortable flight." The meaning behind the sentence hung heavily in the air. Rachel visibly shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, all first-class passengers have assigned seating." Vanessa crossed her arms. "Then move him." Silence spread softly through the cabin now. Several nearby passengers openly listened while pretending not to. Isaiah still said nothing. Rachel lowered her voice slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't move passengers without cause." Vanessa laughed quietly under her breath. "Without cause?" She looked directly at Isaiah now. "Look at him." The words hit harder than she realized, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. Across the aisle, one younger passenger visibly frowned, while another businessman removed one earbud to listen more carefully. Isaiah slowly turned his head toward Rachel. His expression remained calm. Tired, maybe, but calm. "If it helps," he said softly, "I don't mind moving." Rachel immediately shook her head. "No, sir. Your seat is here." Vanessa leaned back sharply. "Unbelievable!" Her voice rose louder now. "I spent thousands on these flights, and now I'm expected to sit beside—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. But she didn't need to finish it. Everyone nearby already understood exactly what she meant. The atmosphere inside first class changed completely now. Conversations quieted, phones lowered. Even passengers farther down the cabin began looking toward row 2 after hearing Vanessa's raised voice. Flight attendants exchanged nervous glances near the galley, while boarding continued more slowly behind them. Vanessa no longer seemed embarrassed about making the scene public. In fact, the audience appeared to encourage her. "This is ridiculous," she snapped while adjusting the expensive scarf around her neck. "There are standards in first class for a reason." Isaiah quietly folded his hands in his lap. The old Marine veteran had faced combat zones, military funerals, and decades of public disrespect after returning home from war. But somehow, public humiliation in peaceful places always carried its own special kind of exhaustion. Rachel remained standing awkwardly beside the seat. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I need you to lower your voice." Vanessa ignored her completely. Did he even pay for this seat himself? Gasps spread quietly through the cabin. A middle-aged woman farther down the aisle whispered, "Wow," beneath her breath, while another passenger slowly began recording on his phone near the window. Isaiah finally looked directly at Vanessa now. His voice remained calm. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "I did." Vanessa gave a cold little laugh. "Sure." Rachel's expression hardened slightly now. "Ma'am, that's enough." But Vanessa wasn't finished. "No, actually, it isn't enough. People pay for comfort up here. People pay not to deal with—" Again she stopped herself before saying the ugliest part out loud. But once again, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The entire cabin already felt it sitting heavily in the air. Isaiah slowly looked down at the old duffel bag resting near his feet. A small Marine Corps emblem was stitched into the faded fabric near the zipper. One younger flight attendant near the galley noticed it immediately. Her face changed slightly. She quietly whispered something toward another crew member. Meanwhile, Vanessa reached for the call button again. "Get your supervisor," she demanded. "Or get the captain, because I'm not sitting beside him." The cabin fell painfully quiet after that sentence, and standing near the galley now, one flight attendant had already started walking quickly toward the cockpit. Rachel stepped away from the row briefly after quietly apologizing to Isaiah, while Vanessa leaned back smugly, like she had finally regained control of the situation. But farther near the cockpit, tension had already started spreading among the flight crew. The younger flight attendant who noticed the Marine insignia spoke urgently toward the lead attendant. "I think that's Colonel Brooks." The lead attendant frowned. "Who?" "Isaiah Brooks," the younger attendant whispered. "Retired Marine colonel, decorated combat veteran." The lead attendant's expression changed immediately. "Are you sure?" The younger attendant nodded quickly. "My father served under him." Silence hit the small galley area. The lead attendant immediately looked toward first class, where Isaiah still sat quietly beside the window, while Vanessa continued complaining loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. The situation no longer looked like an ordinary passenger dispute now. It looked dangerous, emotionally dangerous. The lead attendant quickly disappeared behind the cockpit door. Meanwhile, in first class, Vanessa continued escalating publicly. "I'm not trying to be rude," she announced loudly, using the exact tone people use right before saying something cruel. "But there are expectations in premium cabins." One businessman near the aisle finally muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ." Another passenger openly shook his head now. The social atmosphere was beginning to turn against Vanessa, but she either didn't notice or didn't care. Isaiah remained silent. That silence bothered people more than if he argued back, because the entire cabin could see the humiliation happening clearly, while the old veteran simply absorbed it without resistance. A few moments later, the cockpit door opened. The lead attendant returned beside a tall, silver-haired pilot wearing captain stripes across his uniform sleeves. The moment the captain looked toward row 2 and saw Isaiah Brooks sitting quietly beside the window, his face changed completely. Not confusion, recognition, immediate recognition. And suddenly, the entire energy inside first class shifted. The captain stopped walking the moment he reached row 2. The entire first-class cabin watched him now, beneath the warm overhead lights, while flight attendants stood frozen near the galley. Vanessa still looked irritated, expecting the pilot to support her complaint. But instead, the captain stared directly at Isaiah with visible disbelief. "Colonel Brooks?" he asked quietly. Isaiah slowly looked up from his seat. For the first time during the entire confrontation, a small expression of recognition crossed his face. "Captain Reynolds," he replied softly. Complete silence spread across the aircraft. Vanessa blinked in confusion, while nearby passengers immediately sensed the atmosphere changing in real time. Captain Reynolds stepped closer now, his voice carrying unmistakable respect. "Sir, I didn't know you were on this flight." Isaiah gave a tired little smile. "I was hoping for a quiet trip." Several passengers exchanged looks immediately after hearing that. Quiet respect now replaced the earlier suspicion spreading through the cabin. Vanessa's posture stiffened slightly. "Captain," she interrupted sharply, "I've been trying to explain there's a seating issue." But the pilot barely looked at her. His eyes remained on Isaiah. "Sir," he said carefully, "I flew evacuation support during Kandahar." Several nearby passengers visibly reacted after hearing the word Kandahar. The captain continued quietly. "Every pilot in our unit knew your name." Vanessa's face slowly lost confidence now, while whispers spread softly through the surrounding rows. One younger businessman near the aisle leaned toward another passenger. "Wait, military?" The captain nodded respectfully toward Isaiah again. "Colonel Brooks trained half the officers who later led operations overseas." The sentence changed everything. The old black man with the worn duffel bag no longer looked invisible to the cabin. Suddenly, passengers saw him differently. The posture, the calmness, the silence, it all rearranged itself into dignity people realized they should have noticed earlier. Vanessa looked trapped now between embarrassment and disbelief. "Well," she muttered weakly, "nobody told me that." Isaiah finally turned toward her fully for the first time. His voice remained soft. Would it have mattered? Silence crushed the cabin completely after that question. Nobody moved, nobody looked away, because deep down, everyone on that plane already knew the answer. The first-class cabin remained frozen beneath the heavy silence hanging over every row. Even passengers farther back sensed something significant had happened near the front of the aircraft. Vanessa opened her mouth briefly, like she wanted to defend herself again. But no words came out this time. The confidence that fueled her earlier cruelty had completely collapsed. Captain Reynolds slowly removed his cap respectfully while standing beside Isaiah's seat. The gesture instantly drew attention throughout the cabin. One by one, several nearby passengers straightened in their seats after realizing what they were witnessing. The lead flight attendant quietly wiped moisture from the corner of her eye, while another crew member near the galley stood completely still. Captain Reynolds looked toward Isaiah again. "Sir," he said softly, "it's an honor to have you aboard." The old Marine veteran nodded politely, uncomfortable with the attention now focused on him. "Thank you, Captain." But the captain wasn't finished. He glanced briefly around the first-class cabin before speaking louder this time. "Many people sitting on this plane tonight enjoy freedoms protected by men like Colonel Brooks." Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. The shame inside the cabin had become almost physical now. Vanessa slowly lowered her eyes toward her lap, while several nearby passengers openly stared at her with disgust. One older woman across the aisle finally muttered under her breath, "Unbelievable." The businessman near the window who earlier stayed silent now shook his head slowly. "He served this country," he said quietly, "and you tried to throw him out of first class." Vanessa looked trapped. Publicly exposed, the exact humiliation she earlier forced onto Isaiah had now turned completely toward her. But Isaiah himself showed no satisfaction. That somehow made the moment even more powerful, because while everyone else looked angry, embarrassed, or ashamed, the old veteran simply looked tired. Tired of proving his humanity before receiving basic respect. Captain Reynolds quietly asked Rachel to delay boarding for another minute before turning back toward the cabin microphone near the galley. Passengers watched closely now while flight attendants stood unusually still beside the aisle. The captain pressed the intercom button. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed through the aircraft, "before departure tonight, I'd like to acknowledge someone special flying with us." The entire plane became silent instantly. Even passengers in economy looked up now hearing the unusual announcement. Captain Reynolds continued, "Colonel Isaiah Brooks served this country for more than 30 years as a United States Marine." Several passengers immediately began clapping softly. The captain raised his hand gently. "Please, let me finish." The cabin quieted again. Colonel Brooks trained officers who later protected American personnel during some of the most dangerous military operations overseas. Many service members flying today owe part of their survival to his leadership. Emotional silence spread throughout the aircraft now, the kind of silence filled with realization. The captain looked directly toward first class again. "And regardless of rank, wealth, or seat assignment, every person wearing this uniform understands what that service means." Several nearby passengers lowered their eyes immediately after hearing those words, because everyone understood the deeper message underneath them. Vanessa sat completely motionless now while passengers around her openly judged her from every direction. One younger traveler near row 3 quietly whispered, "Damn," beneath his breath. Captain Reynolds finally nodded respectfully toward Isaiah one last time before ending the announcement. The applause that followed this time spread through the entire plane. Not loud cheering, not celebration, respect. Real respect, the kind that arrives late but lands heavily once people understand what they almost ignored. After the applause slowly faded, the emotional atmosphere inside first class remained painfully tense. Vanessa sat rigidly beside Isaiah, with both hands clasped tightly in her lap while passengers nearby continued glancing toward her openly. The social power inside the cabin had completely reversed now. Earlier, she controlled the room through status, money, and confidence. Now, she looked isolated, exposed, smaller than before. Finally, after several long minutes of silence, Vanessa spoke quietly without looking directly at Isaiah. "I didn't know." The old veteran stared calmly out the window, where airport lights reflected across the dark runway outside. "That's usually how it starts," he replied softly. Vanessa swallowed hard. "I wasn't trying to—" She stopped herself because even she no longer believed her own excuses. Isaiah slowly looked toward her now. His voice remained calm, but every word carried weight earned through decades of experience. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the problem isn't that you didn't know my rank." He paused briefly. "The problem is how comfortable you felt humiliating someone before knowing anything about them." The sentence crushed whatever defense Vanessa still had left. Nearby passengers openly listened now while several flight attendants remained unusually emotional near the galley. Vanessa's eyes finally filled slightly with embarrassment. Not because she suddenly became compassionate, because for the first time during the flight, she fully understood how everyone around her saw her now. Isaiah gently adjusted the old Marine duffel bag near his feet. "Respect shouldn't depend on medals," he said softly, "or titles." Silence settled over the cabin again. Deep silence. The kind people remember long after flights end. Several hours later, as the aircraft descended slowly toward Los Angeles beneath dark evening clouds, the emotional atmosphere inside the plane felt entirely different from the tension that filled it before takeoff. Most passengers remained unusually quiet throughout the flight. Some slept. Others stared silently out windows. But nearly everyone aboard kept replaying the confrontation in their minds, especially the moment they realized how quickly public humiliation had transformed into public shame. Isaiah Brooks spent most of the flight reading quietly from an old notebook resting on the tray table beside him. He spoke little, accepted no special treatment, asked for nothing. And somehow, that quiet dignity affected people more than any dramatic confrontation could have. As the plane touched down smoothly onto the runway, Captain Reynolds made one final announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "thank you for flying with us tonight, and Colonel Brooks, on behalf of this crew, thank you for your service." Soft applause spread through the cabin once more. Isaiah lowered his eyes briefly before nodding politely. Vanessa remained silent beside him the entire time. When the aircraft finally reached the gate, passengers slowly stood and gathered luggage from overhead bins. But something unusual happened near the front of first class. People began quietly stepping aside, allowing Isaiah to exit first. No one instructed them to do it. Nobody announced it. The crowd simply made space for him naturally, respectfully. As Isaiah lifted the old duffel bag over his shoulder and prepared to leave the aircraft, Vanessa finally looked at him one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered quietly. Isaiah studied her face for several seconds before answering softly, I hope next time you don't need someone's resume before deciding they deserve dignity." Then he walked calmly down the aisle toward the aircraft door, while passengers watched silently from every row. And standing there, beneath the soft cabin lights, many people on that plane understood the same uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous kind of prejudice is not always loud hatred. Sometimes it's quiet entitlement disguised as normal behavior, until someone forces the room to see it clearly.